Hello again. Now we're moving on to Unit 4, which is Veteran Trees as Ecosystems. And this photograph shows some of the things that we're talking about, the hollows, the large decaying wood, and the different types of decay. So this unit is divided into two, which is, the first one is that you need to be able to describe the wide range of ecological values of veteran trees and how they fit into the wider ecosystem. And then we will be expecting you to be able to identify veteran tree habitats in situ. So you will be expected to be able to spot the different types of habitats that are valuable for other species on the tree on site. So first of all, the first one was describe the wide range of ecological values of veteran trees and how they fit into the wider ecosystem. And so what we mean by that is that you need to be able to explain the importance for biodiversity of abundant, good quality veteran tree habitat continuously present for centuries. So that the fact that our veteran trees very often have high quality habitat. So species associated with veteran trees have developed over thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And the fact we have so many species associated with veteran trees indicates that veteran trees were probably much more common. The habitats that they have take time to develop and are relatively stable over time. And that meant that there was no need for species to adapt because their new conditions didn't change quite as quickly. And these species need very often stability over time. So we create stable conditions in the houses that we build, for example, thick walls and insulation, and we heat the space to make it good for us. We wouldn't survive as well in a tent. That's the kind of analogy. And individual trees can provide a range of different habitats for different species, but a single tree cannot provide that over time because it will change. There will be a succession. But one single hollow, for example, can host more than 10 or 15 different species of invertebrate at one moment in time. And that those niches can be hollows that are on the sunny side of the tree or the shaded side of the tree or filled with water or otherwise. And we would expect you to be able to explain why it needs to be continuously present. And the trees, the veteran trees, are the keystone species, as we would call them. They are the kind of umbrella because they support so many other species. And the next element in this unit, or the first section in this fourth unit, is that you need to be able to also explain the importance of the distribution of veteran trees in the landscape and the mobility of associated organisms. And that's because, as I've just said, there is succession in each individual tree, which means that species do need to be able to move. However, a suitable tree needs to be close enough for that individual species to be able to move to it, and it shouldn't have a barrier in the way. So that's the kind of thing we expect you to be able to understand. The distance between the trees is important. The mobility of the species that we're talking about. So, for example, you should be aware of the fact there are some species that can move long distances, if we're talking about a woodpecker, but there are other species like some of the beetle species which are much less inclined to move long distances. And if there's a barrier in the way, for example, a large spruce woodland or an arable desert in between, those species may not be able to fly far enough to find the next suitable tree. So the dispersal in generally is not well understood with many of the species associated with veteran trees, but the closer the distance is between suitable trees, the greater chance of successful dispersal. And that some of the invertebrates may only move in the range of a few hundred metres, whereas fungi may move many, many kilometres. And there are actually relatively few sites with what we would say enough veteran trees and successor trees remaining actually in Europe. So these three elements are important for you to be able to understand and explain that that's what's needed in order to support the species associated with veteran trees in the landscape. Then we would want you to be able to describe how an individual veteran tree sits in a wider landscape ecosystem, and that these processes are linked. So we often talk about ecology, that you kind of pull a string in one place and a bell rings somewhere else. That we would expect, veteran trees in a wood pasture, for example, are impacted by the management or lack of management on their surroundings. So if grazing stops, they become shaded, the habitat changes, and species may be lost. So it's broader than the individual veteran tree, but that the individual veteran tree is part of something larger, and that these may be linked together. That's very important for a vet specialist to understand. And that species may have different requirements at different times of their lives. And if we take the example of, say, a green woodpecker, that requires holes, and it makes holes to nest in, but it feeds on ants. So it requires more open grassland where the meadow ants can make their nests in order to survive. So when managing veteran trees, we want you to be able to describe how a holistic approach is important, because you can't just look after a single individual tree. You have to look after the populations of trees, and you have to ensure that this takes consideration of the fact that there are wider processes happening and connected to the individual trees. And arboriculture does tend to focus on individual trees and may even treat that tree in isolation. So it's really important for you who are planning to take vet cert that you can think more broadly than that. And then we would expect you to be able to demonstrate an understanding of the complexity and the diversity of habitats veteran trees can provide. So the fact that the difference between tree species, between the fungal species that are on those trees, the management history and what kind of impact that may or may not have had on the process changes over time, and that species requirements may differ. So the fungal species may feed on sapwood or oak heartwood, and they in turn change the environment suitable for other fungal species to come in. That we wouldn't expect you to be able to identify all of these species, but we would expect you to be able to demonstrate that you understand that it's very complex and very diverse, and that things like, wood mold, a late stage decay product, has a different pH perhaps compared with younger trees of the same species, that you've got different types of wood decay due to fungal interactions and different species. We know, for example, that many beetles are not so much associated with the tree species, but are in fact associated with the fungal species that's undertaking the breakdown, so the decay that's being created. And that, we've got early versus late stage decay, we've got brown versus white rot. So understanding that is variable, that there's succession, that there's differences. Then we would expect you also to be able to identify issues that impact on sustainability of tree populations, of veteran tree populations. So the obvious choice is the more trees you have, the more sustainable it is. The mortality rate of those trees, if it's a high mortality rate, then clearly you have a problem on your hands. And this is an ash tree that's died from ash dieback, and that we have mortality rate, for example, is often higher in veteran tree populations that have become overgrown and shaded. That where you have low numbers of veteran trees, they're vulnerable and potentially unsustainable. We have many sites, for example, that have a generation gap. So there's a big gap between the oldest trees and the younger trees, then issues of tree diseases, of course. All of these things will impact on veteran tree populations, and we would expect you to be able to identify those issues that potentially impact. So then the second element of this unit is to be able to identify veteran tree habitats actually on site. So look at the trees and point them out. And of course, some of them are very obvious, and most of you will be familiar with these too. So this is an area that we would expect most people to be relatively comfortable with. but it's about the range of potential microhabitats associated with veteran trees. And I've already talked a little bit about that, but the microhabitats, the fact that you may have a hollow in, the low down on the tree, you may have a hollow in a buttress root, and that may be filled with water, compared with one that's up in the tree that's exposed to the sun and is very dry. So this is about applying your knowledge as well. So understanding that you've got broken branches that are in the sun or in the shade, and that you can understand and identify those, that a sap run can be wet to sticky or dry, and that different species use those different sorts of conditions. So once again, we're not expecting you to be able to identify all those species, but we are expecting you to be able to identify the range of different potential habitats that would be available on the old trees, or that exist on the old trees. This is from a page that's taken out of the David Lonsdale book that I've already mentioned, and it's a useful summary. It's not exhaustive, but it just gives you a summary of the kinds of sorts of habitats you might expect to find in an old tree. And then I guess this is where it's about applied knowledge, that we want you to be able to demonstrate an understanding of how management may affect key species associated with veteran trees. So, for example, if you clear around a veteran tree, what impact may that have on the species associated with it? And it may be very positive for the tree, clearing around it, but it may not be completely positive for the species. So if we take lichens and mosses as example, mosses often prefer damp and more shaded environment compared with lichens. Now that's generalizing, but there is a potential for a tree being opened up around. If it's done very quickly, that's not ideal for the tree, but it may not also be ideal for the species associated with it, because it will change the temperature, the amount of exposure, and the humidity and the local climate. So a tree, for example, which has been pollarded and is regularly pollarded, that may speed up the process of hollowing. So we would expect you to have this applied knowledge about what impact your management may have on species. Again, we're not expecting you to be able to identify all these species, but at least have an understanding of the more general requirements that they have. That, pruning a tree may remove potential habitat. Of course, if you've got a hazard beam, for example, you remove that and you will remove some habitat. Removal of basal shoots may be positive for the lichens associated with the tree, but not positive for the tree. So there can be positive and negative impacts of management, and that's something that we would want you to be able to demonstrate, that you understand that connection between management and the species living in and on the trees. Then a kind of very specific thing, this is where we would expect you to be able to identify the decaying wood of different types and the stages of decay. So brown rot, white soft rot, and wood mould, the later or latter stages of decay. What are the defining features of the types of decay? How can you tell the difference? We would expect you both to be able to identify these in the field, but also to connect what species of fungi may cause these different types of decay. So again, that's a specific identification feature that we would expect you to know. So finally, some of the resources that are available to support you in this particular unit. There's chapter 7 in Helen Reid's book is Management of Veteran Trees for Other Organisms. Is a good overview and summary of some of the things to think about with regard to other species. In David Lonsdale's book, chapter 5 talks about habitat quality and continuity in wood pasture, parkland, orchards and hedgerows, and picks up the requirements for different species and the species associated with veteran trees. This is a fantastic book if you want to dive in more deeply. The Biodiversity in Dead Wood. It's written by a number of different people and has a lot of information about species associated with decaying wood and trees. But the VetCert has produced a fact sheet which talks about the species groups and guilds. So once again, this is to help you understand that we're not expecting you to be able to identify every single beetle that lives on an old tree. And there's no one who can do that, or there are people who can do that, but then they can't do something else. But we do expect you to have a working knowledge of the management requirements and what impact your management may have on the tree. So there's a fact sheet from VetCert, then there's also an ancient tree guide about the wildlife associated with veteran trees as well. And then there's a whole host of videos as well. Again, these are Lynn Body videos that we produced about the different types of wood decay, heart rot and hollowing of beech and oak. They're really worth looking at and give a good insight to this very complicated topic. So that's a quick run through Unit 4. And next time we'll be focusing on Unit 5 and 6, their value for people and the cultural history value of veteran trees. And I'll remind you once again to note down any questions that you've got so we can pick them up when we have our question and answer session. Thank you.